Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, since we've gone online, which is live online, people just stay in their comfort zones and they watch me from bubble baths and from different comfortable environments. But that's the beauties and the virtues and vices of technology, right? You can see me in Dallas and here in person. So this class used to be pretty full house, but it's very full online. So that's, I guess, the consolation. So welcome. Can there be growth without pain? That's the theme. And the reason I chose this theme this week is, well, it's always a relevant theme because so many of us deal with challenges. I mean, everyone deals with challenges, some harsher than others. And life, as many can testify, is often filled with more pain than with joy, at least on a quantitative level. Like if you add up all the things in your life, very often the painful and the losses, the painful experiences, the losses, the hurt, is often overshadows the positive. And God should bless everyone that we should have the minimum of pain and the maximum of joy. But life is life, and throws different curveballs at us. So I've discussed many times the actual discussion of pain itself, of course, and how to grow through it. But what I was thinking, it's always been intrigued me, that because especially in the work that I do, teaching and counseling and writing, dealing, of course, with the human condition, you always find, sadly, tragically, that pain is often the catalyst that causes most change in life. That people do not wake up until there's something that is taken from them. You know, very easy to take for granted our blessings. And if someone is in their comfort zone, it's one of the hardest things is to get them out of it. And God bless everybody, they should have their comfort zones. But it's definitely not exactly conducive for growth. Because comfort zone by definition means I'm comfortable, I'm content. So why rock the boat? Why change things? And then, unfortunately, when there's some form of trauma, loss, death, a change in status, especially negative experiences, suddenly it shakes up your comfort zones. It pulls out your security blankets from under you, from over you, and you're thrust into a new reality, one that we really don't want. And that is, as I said, the catalyst, the seed of change, because now you're no longer able to maintain the status quo. Now, there are people, through pain, become more bitter and angry and broken and humiliated and demoralized, etc. But there are many that type of experience does wake them up, and they really look at their lives in new ways. I mean, there are many that come to mind, but one just, for some reason, just popped in my mind right now. I remember 9/11, we all remember 9/11, of course, which besides, of course, almost 3,000 deaths, some people I actually knew, and I met afterwards who had lost young husbands. I think it was disproportionately more men that died than women, I believe, right? Is that correct? Cantor Fitzgerald, which was almost completely wiped out, the financial firm. So there was one guy that I knew that did not work there. He worked in another firm, but he was always jealous of his friend who had this like 89th floor windows view of the entire Hudson River and New Jersey and all the way to California, maybe, in a clear day. And he told me afterwards that this friend of his was killed, was one of the people killed instantly, obviously. And he suddenly, it shook him up because he worked in the financial industry. And there it's a very, very tough and rough and dog eats dog, sharks, and you're actually almost compelled by your by superiors to compete with your best friends, and a lot of backstabbing as people want to climb the ladder and want to succeed, and basically loyalties and real friendships get mostly compromised in these scenarios, in the search for corporate glory or financial reward. So he said, I got caught up in the same thing, and I became jealous because my friend, who we were good buddies when we were kids, had this bay window And I used to look at him from a little office that I had a few blocks away, and I was jealous. And then that morning came. And it wasn't just that it changed my life. I lost a friend of mine, but I suddenly realized how petty and how empty my life was. That was what bothered me. And his life changed dramatically after that. He quit his job, even though he didn't suffer directly, but the whole thing just shook him up, which, as I said, shake-ups happen. How does Leonard Cohen put it? That forget your perfect offering, that everyone has cracks in their lives. But remember, the cracks is how the light gets through. I may be paraphrasing that exact quote. But it's a powerful statement, which of course Leonard Cohen takes much from his Jewish roots, and of course a general Jewish concept, which I'll talk about in a moment, that the cracks is how the light gets through. And you think about it, that's true. How does a chick get out of an egg? The egg has to crack. So from the perspective of someone that's never seen a cracked egg, you may think the egg is perishing. It's the end of everything because it's cracking. And in truth, the crack is really the opening of a new birth. So when we look at it from a very myopic perspective, things that seem to be breaks or cracks and so on can appear to be destructive. And in truth, they are the beginning of a new era or a new beginning. Any woman gave birth knows the beauty of a child, but there is birth pangs for the child to come through the channel. There's the challenges of pregnancy. And wherever you look in life, you'll find that before there's any new paradigm, new metamorphosis, new growth, anything that is worth talking about, is always preceded by some type of crack or break. To put it in simple terms, you need to shed one layer of skin to assume a new layer of skin, and you simply can't have them both. Psychologically speaking, if your mindset is the one of yesterday, you're not going to discover something new today if you don't have a new mindset. So how do you change an existing mindset? So unfortunately, it seems that negative experiences are more effective in that regard than positive ones. In other words, if you were to give someone a blessing and they suddenly hit gold and they made millions of dollars, which also should be a jolt to the system, and yet they will not have a wake-up call like if a tragedy happens. Why is that the case? So this has been plaguing me, because I deal with people all the time. Very often you deal with people that have challenges, whether it's in relationships, bad habits, people growing up in very dysfunctional homes, and how do you get out of that rut of your own either low self-image or destructive behaviors or addictions. Everyone's got their so-called series of stuff, baggage that we'd like to somewhat change. They talk about New Year's as New Year resolutions. As we all know, New Year resolutions last from New Year to not the next New Year, from the morning to the evening, if even then. So change. I'm going to start losing weight. I'm going to start exercising. I'm going to start doing this, start doing that. So that's obviously another discussion why we can't hold on to our resolutions. Maybe I'll touch upon that as well. But the bigger issue here is when you're dealing with people, and as I said, speaking to people, one of the biggest frustrating things is an intelligent person knows that their life needs some type of shift, and yet they cannot bring themselves to change. Whether it's because we're creatures of habit, whether it's just getting stuck in a place and it's just the known evil is worse than the unknown evil, et cetera, et cetera. There's hundreds of reasons you can explain. And you always wonder, I'm always looking for that magic word or the magic pill. What can you do to wake somebody up who can't wake themselves up? And sadly, you witness, again, not the way we like to see it, is that when something negative happens, some loss, there's nothing that wakes the person up like that. So of course it would be the billion-dollar question, can we find something positive that can wake someone up with the same intensity as something negative? So I've been always thinking to my mind, maybe I can come up with something. Maybe tonight is the night. Who knows? And you'll hear it here first. So that's essentially the driving impetus for my discussing this topic. But it also happens to correspond, as those of you who've listened to these classes know, I try to connect it to the Bible, something from the Torah, which means that every one of the 52 weeks of the year corresponds to one of the chapters in the Torah, and each week has 7 days, so there's 7 sections in each chapter. So there's a fascinating statement in this week's chapter, which is really a good departure point for our discussion here. Now, of course, this chapter documents maybe the first documented institutional slavery in history. You know, we all know slavery of the United States, of the blacks in a few centuries back, and all its implications. There have been, of course, the slavery that's going on today in different countries, especially in Africa and other places, where one nation subjugates another nation under its rule and is unjust in that process to the point of oppression and genocide or whatever we find in history. The tragic, one of the worst inhumanities of man to man. It's one thing when one person is inhumane to another, but then when a nation is inhumane to another nation, for all of us, it seems to touch a nerve that's far worse, even though obviously any injustice is a tragedy. But when it's national, when it's industrialized, that's not the word I want. Institutionalized, it becomes far more, especially when we look back at the Nazis, for example, turn it into a whole machine and efficiency. So the first documented is stories, of course, one of the most famous stories in general in history, the story of Exodus, which is this book is called the Book of Exodus. Yeah, films made about it, cartoons, Prince of Egypt, the Ten Commandments. I mean, we have Hollywood. As soon as anything hits Hollywood, it's become critical mass. But the story, truthfully, of course, starts long before Hollywood. But it touches a chord because you have the first, as I said, the first documentation. And what's the story? The story is that the Jewish people are living in Egypt due to the great famine that we read about earlier. So they came to Egypt because Egypt had the only storehouse, of grain. So Jacob and 70 souls, his family of 70, come down to Egypt, and things are good for a number of years. But then that generation starts to die. Jacob, his sons, and then it says so the Torah puts it in a very, again, very poignant and powerful way, because you'll see in a moment, as I discuss always, the relevance of it is so powerful because you could use these words in our lives today. It says, Vayokom melech chadash in Hebrew. A new king arose. And there's actually two opinions. Was it a new king, or was it a king that suddenly decided to have a very timely amnesia to all the favors that the Jewish people had done for him? But regardless, it's interesting because that's what you find. Usually a regime change. A new president, a new emperor, a new king, a new monarch. And if you know in history, new monarchs changed the course of history. It was a benevolent monarch, a benevolent leader. Obviously, that brought great blessings to people. If it was unfortunately a despot, a cruel, a fascist, or whatever you want to call them, obviously changed the course of history the other way. So here it says a new king arises, new leader arises, and he has a new attitude. And he goes to his people and say, these Jews are proliferating. They're growing because they have children, and soon they will swarm the entire land and they will control us. So we need to come up with a plot, a conspiracy to subjugate them, to get them under control. And it was essentially, you read it, it's almost, when you read how the Nazis in Germany slowly and methodically demonized the Jews, or anyone that they considered to be, what's the word, enemies. Exactly the same thing. You don't begin overnight and suddenly start killing people. You begin first demonizing, propaganda, saying that this is a threat to us. You got to get the people to, and you really have it documented. It's interesting, you have it documented. So I can elaborate on the details. It's pretty gory, some of it, how they began to slowly take away their rights, slowly convince them, work for us, and in time, enslave them. Enslaved an entire people. And so there are lessons to be learned, historical lessons, both of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, and also the noble side of things, how the Jews ultimately were freed with the leadership of Moses and emancipated. And again, the first documented, you could say, national emancipation from slavery, which again has many lessons that can be learned. And as a matter of fact, there were actually black leaders who were anti-abolitionists and so on, or abolitionists, I should say, not anti-abolitionists, from the North, who actually cited many biblical statements. For them was an inspiration, especially in those years when they were trying to find that type of the freedoms. So they were looking at the Bible, they looked for direction and inspiration because they had a story. The story of Exodus was the story of, they identified with that story. But then there's this line, right in the beginning, I think it's verse 12. chapter 1, verse 12, Exodus 1:12. It says like this, Kashayano Isam. The more they were oppressed, the Jews that is, Ken Yirba v'chen Yifritz. The more they multiplied and more they thrived and they proliferated and they grew. It's an interesting statement. Because in healing, today it's used tremendously that we talk about, like there's the line, that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. I'm sure you've heard that. That pain, when turned and used the right way, it could end up making you a far greater person. And that the first time that's ever stated is this verse. It says, as they were oppressed, they thrived and say thrived and thrived. Two different words. Thrived and proliferated would be the best word. Now there's another expression similarly in the Talmud. It talks about olive oil. So it says, again, a very strong statement, that an olive does not produce oil until you press it. And that again is used, the idea that when you feel pressure, it brings out the best of you, which we see. Take away competition. And I'm talking about healthy competition in school and sports and so on. Some of the greatest achievements in history were a result because, think of people like the number one tennis player, Djokovic. He'll say that he became that way because of his opponents, not because of his talent, because they pushed him and he wanted to excel. Had they not pushed him, he wouldn't have gone that far. Now, you can't force that. Something has to push you. You can't just, in your mind, say, I'm going to get better. You need that resistance. Think of it this way. If I wanted to know how strong you are, how can I? You can use your hand to pressure. But if I put a lot of resistance, and then we see how you react to that resistance. So resistance brings out the strength in an individual. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt that said about women, that women are like tea bags. They're like tea bags. You don't know how strong they are until you put them into hot water. So interesting, you look at a tea bag, it's an innocuous, innocent little tea bag. You have no idea, a little few leaves in there. You stick it into hot water, and suddenly it blossoms. And this is, time and again you find this. I mean, there's that sad story where they tell, I think I repeated it a number of times. So of course a butterfly doesn't begin as a butterfly, it begins as a caterpillar. And a caterpillar goes into its chrysalis, which is the cocoon-like state for a period of time. And then it begins to open up, as I said, the cocoon begins to crack open, and slowly a butterfly emerges. So the story they tell is a parable or analogy that someone who was watching this cocoon slowly opening and saw this butterfly struggling to get out because, so he thought in his great compassion, he's going to help the butterfly. So he went and took a knife or scissors and cut open the cocoon. And there you go. No more struggle. Butterfly, beautiful monarch butterfly, but he's waiting and waiting and waiting to see what happens. The butterfly cannot fly. It's grounded. And then someone tells him the little secret that for a butterfly to fly, it needs a certain aerodynamics. It needs a certain amount of liquid in its wings. How does that liquid get into its wings? The pressure, as it's struggling to get out of the cocoon, forces the liquid through the wings. And because you cut the cocoon open, the butterfly never continued struggling. So you gave it a nice retirement, literally, and it will never fly. So look how tragic that is. So his good intentions were, why let the butterfly struggle? But that struggle was critical to his life. So let's go back now. So in that context, that's why I felt also appropriate this week to talk about it. The idea, can there be growth without pain? Because as it says, it appears to be, I'm not suggesting every growth in history and every growth in our lives is always through pain, but there's nothing like pain to motivate somebody. So we hate it, but after the fact, we sometimes thank it because that's what brought us to greatness. You read the stories about Steve Jobs. He captures the imagination of the American public, the world, Apple. And you read the story where Isaacson's Steve Jobs, now it's a film. And reading the book, you get the impression you see this genius on one hand, but you see also a lot of pain in this person's life. And you wonder immediately, could he have achieved any of that without the pain, without the loss, without his childhood, the things he's gone through? not always a very pleasant character. We're not talking about that, but you find this time and again. And it's always fascinating. I always found it fascinating. We all love success stories. But then when you look about the beginning of every success story, is usually not a success story. It's usually a failure somewhere. Some bankruptcy, some loss, some failure. Because there's no such thing as something just begins. I was reading, one of the big industries today is Time Warner, right? But Time Warner used to be Time magazine. It was the first news magazine in the United States. Now, it was founded by Luce and, I forgot the other guy's name, Harvey, something with an H, in the early 20th century. These were two teenagers, two young students, who decided, let's create a summary of the news of the week so people can just sum up at the end of the week and read everything that happened. They showed it around, their idea, and everybody laughed them out the door, including their families. What are you talking about? We read the New York Times every day. Why is anyone interested 6 days later to hear about news I read on Sunday? Why would I want to hear it on Friday? And they had this dream. But if you think about it, it was completely illogical. It's true. Remember, it's a different world. There was no internet then. All you had was a newspaper. So if you know news from Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, who's interested in hearing about it at the end of the week, a summary? But they were persisted, and they didn't have any money. So what they did was they patched together some type of news magazine, and they stuck it into mailboxes in their areas where they lived, only to be reported to the police as being, whatever. They're terrorizing. They're what do they call it? Passing out. What's the word? There's a word for it. Loitering. What is it? Trespassing. So you can imagine. Now, if you go back 1905, 1906, whenever it happened, and you were there, you never have a dream something's going to come of this, And they had disappointment after disappointment. This is small stories. There are real horror stories that led to unbelievable successes. But what you had was two people with a vision, with persistence, and probably with a lot of naivete. So they didn't ask so many questions. They just had a crazy dream, and that's that. Just like the Wright brothers, someone would come and tell you, we're going to build a flying ship. A flying ship, birds fly, and we're going to have a flying ship. And how much is it going to weigh? Hundreds of tons. How much does a plane weigh? Whatever. I don't know if that's what they calculated at that point. And that's going to fly, really. Nothing has ever defied gravity. You're building a flying ship. Every time a plane takes off, I think about it. I look out the window, I say, two crazy guys who nobody would have invested a penny with them, But they set their mind to it, and now you have airports, and we got to take off shoes unless you're pre-TSA or whatever it is, and the whole hassle of flying. And it's a whole city in a city, right? What? Because some guys decided they want to emulate a bird. Now, I'm sure the disappointments, the failures, how many times those planes crashed when they tested them, must have been quite depressing. So what you see is that besides the persistence, which of course drives the dream, is that there's almost no success story. I would even argue that I don't think there is a success story that did not have some failure. And the failure became a lessons learned, what went wrong and so on. I mean, they say war is the father of all invention. Most of the technologies we have today are a result of World War I and World War II. Who would believe that? You think war would produce, because war creates necessity of efficiency, to be better than the enemy, to be faster. The internet was an invention of the Army. The U.S. military created in the 40s a secret way of communicating with each other globally. It was complete secret. No one knew about it until the late 60s, when then the government, after developing, it was not possible that anyone develop an internet with all, you needed the amount of money you needed in investing. Initial investment would be prohibitive to any company. The government did that. And then they unleashed it and gave it to the universities. That's why the first URLs were extensions, were edu, universities. And then it slowly came to the market. The same with fax machines, the same with all technology we have today. It's either war or the exploration of space, which also developed a bunch of technologies. I mean, I never made a whole list. But it's always some resistance, some challenge. In this case, war. An interesting statistic I saw, an interesting thing that I saw, which you never would believe. You know that in the Middle Ages they called the Dark Ages because it was called the plague. In the middle of in the 15th, 16th century, there was the plague that killed, they say, 60% of European population. I mean, that's a serious number, which means no family was not affected. More than half, even more maybe. I don't remember the numbers. It was vast numbers. It was also a way they accused Jews for the poisoning the wells, as always, but that's a separate story. And so what you think, is there any redeeming factor in the plague that killed so many people? And there is. I'm not suggesting it was a blessing, but something came out of it that people don't realize. There would be no modern age as we know it without it. Not that it's the only factor, but it was a major factor. You know what it is? The workforce. Up till that point, the workforce was so plentiful. That was what fed the bourgeois abuse of the working class, because you could always fire somebody and bring someone else. Everyone needed the work. The plague affected everyone across the board, the aristocrats and the proletariat equally. But since the proletariat were the majority, they had the most deaths, so suddenly the workforce was cut by 60%. So the lords and the monarchs didn't just have, anybody, we could just throw you out because there's another 20 people looking for a job. So suddenly it empowered the lower class. And that was the beginnings that empowered them to beginnings in the birthing of capitalism, the rights of workers. Now, you'd never think of that. Who would think such a thing? Anyway, all these are just a few examples among many, many, many that you'll find, that rarely will you find, or if at all, a real spurt of growth without a tremendous loss somewhere. Some tragedy, some crack. Now, going back to the question then, it only gets amplified even further, because based on what I said from the chapter, it says, as they were oppressed, that's in direct proportion to that. That's how they grew. That's simply suggesting that without oppression, you don't grow. Or you don't grow leaps and bounds. Because if there's no crack in the old system, why would it lead to the new system? Why would anyone think of a new system? Some scientists say, I forgot who, but they say you can never change a system from within a system. Because anything within the system is part of the system, it's part of the problem. It's like trying to ask a person who's not well to find a cure to their illness. They're part of the problem. So you need to have some type of perspective from outside, like a bird's eye view, an objective view, and so on and so forth. One of the things about Einstein that is talked about, that he was a postal clerk. He was obviously a brilliant scientist in many ways, but he did not go by conventional. If he had gone to the conventional scientific conferences and read the journals, they say he would never have discovered what he discovered. You needed someone to think from outside the box. And he was able to do that through his dreaming, whatever it is. You'll always see, bottom line is, that within a structure, there has to be a crack for it to reveal a deeper light. So again, the question, as I said, as I posed, is it possible without pain? Now, this is also a theological question from a Jewish perspective, because you could argue that all growth comes through some form of oppression, that the Jewish people would not be as smart and not be as resourceful and not have endured had they not been challenged. So there's a theory, there's a concept, there's a statement that said that when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes, there'll be a messianic age of world peace and harmony, and there will be the eradication of what we know as evil. We will yearn for the days in Gullus, in the days of diaspora, in the days of displacement, when we had the struggle. There's an interesting statement. Now, here's an observation, which is another one of the human paradoxes that we all suffer from, and that is this. When you're busy at work, you dream about vacation. And when you're on vacation for too long, you dream about work. Now, you see anybody, like in very, very tough times, you start thinking, I can't wait till this is over. Then I'm traveling. I'm going to go to the beach. I'm going to find a person I love, listen to some music, drink some wine, and relax. Now, if you're a person that's active, you relax. For how long can you relax? 1 day, 2 days. At some point, something starts, restlessness, and so on. There are people, I've met some people that have mastered the art of animal bliss, where they can just lie on a beach and sunbathe literally endlessly. But they had to probably kill a certain, some spirit inside of them to do that. It's just not human nature. So when we're struggling, we'd like to have some type of respite. And with too much respite, we yearn, there's an urge in us to get back to producing. Because we feel we need to produce. So which one is it? So we hate the idea that we have deadlines. I can tell you as a writer, as a speaker, who likes deadlines? But on the other hand, if I didn't have any deadlines, I'd still probably be writing my first article. So the idea that there is that you have to beat the clock, there's a deadline, there's the pressure of getting something done by a certain time with goals, etc., that finances are running low. Whatever it is that's causing you to move is a critical component in the whole picture. And yet, we look for that which is beyond that type of struggle. So there's an interesting statement in the Talmud that says a contradiction. It says on one hand, the righteous, the scholars, they have no peace, not in this world and not in the world to come. They're always restless. They're always traveling, in that sense, spiritually traveling. And then there's a statement that we will come to a time in life where will be a complete, perpetual, and eternal peace and rest. The same word is used, that will be eternal peace. And here it says they will have no peace. So the obvious question is, which one is it? Which is a greater blessing? And is it a contradiction? So the answer, fascinating answer, which also compels us to rethink the entire theme that we're discussing here about growth and what leads to growth, and that is the idea that there's two types of restlessness. One is a healthy restlessness and one is an unhealthy one. The unhealthy version I think we all can relate to, and that's when you have anxiety, fear, real insecurity, the things that shake us up, that will really disturb us. And it's not good energy. It's energy that demoralizes us, it weakens us, it doesn't motivate us. Then there's another restlessness, the healthy sort. The healthy sort restlessness is exact opposite. It's also restless. You're not at peace, but it's a restlessness that motivates you. I want to achieve more. There's a goal I haven't reached yet. So it's a frustration, but you can't quite call it the anxiety, the depressing sort of anxiety. This is more of an angst that is like a catalyst that pushes you, that propels you to move faster, to run faster, to reach higher, and so on. They're very, very different. They both have one thing in common, that you're not stationary. You're not sedentary. You're not standing in one place. You're not static. You're moving. But one is running from a fire, and the other was running toward a treasure. That's very, very different. So sometimes you see people who seem to be very cool and hip, and they're on the move. They're running, and you think like, wow, I'd love to be part of their lives. And then you find out they're not running anywhere. They're running away. How was the line that the Eagles sing? Some dance to remember and some dance to forget. So you both are dancing, but this one's dancing to forget and this one's dancing to remember. It's very different. Or sing to remember or sing to forget. Some people drink to forget. Some people drink to remember, I guess. The point I'm making here is that it can look to the naked eye, it could appear, oh wow, this person's really moving. But if you look deeper, it could be they're running away. They're not able to settle down. And they're afraid. They're running out of fear, with the other ones running out of strength. Very, very different. So when the Talmud is saying that they will have no peace, and then it says there'll be eternal peace, what it's saying is very simple. They'll be at peace, eternal peace, with having no peace. So many of us are not at peace with that. They will be at peace with restlessness, basically. So it's a very interesting statement. But it's healthy restlessness. So we confuse the two. Many of us say, you know what, I don't want a restless life. I want to have calm and peace. Most of us are really saying is I've been hurt. I've struggled. I have cried nights. I've stayed up. I had enough anxiety. I just want to have a little peace of mind. That's what we mean when we say that. Because we may not have even tasted healthy restlessness. All we've tasted is fear. Listen, when a child tragically grows up in a dysfunctional home, where they do not feel the comfort and the security of parents that are there for them. Their father never comes home. The mother's drinking. I'm just giving a strong example, obviously. Or even worse forms of beyond absenteeism, real forms of abuse. What does it do to a child? It disrupts the child's equilibrium. They don't feel they deserve calm and peace. And their lives are driven by running, looking somewhere desperately for some calm. Because that's what a child deserves. A young child, if you look in a healthy home, you'll see so healthy things don't have a sensation. Unhealthy things have sensation. It's dull, it's sharp, it's blocked, it's this. I mean, so that's really for a child. Not to say that a good child is not going to have memories. Of course, there'll be beautiful memories. But you're not going to have dramatic, oh, this happened. Because the beauty of a healthy home is that they just feel the security of going to sleep. What about a child that goes to sleep crying every night because they're waiting for their mother? Or a child going crying because they're terrified of what their father's going to do when he comes home? You know, I'm just using examples, unfortunately real ones. That child, after a point, loses its innocence and loses its sense that it deserves to have a calm night of sleep. And there's no way that child's not going to have to go through unhealthy restlessness. Now, there's always help. I'm not suggesting anyone has damaged goods and you can't fix the problem. I'm just trying to point out where unhealthy restlessness comes from. That child will always be looking because they're very much on edge. You'll see people who have their antenna up all the time. Why are they so sensitive? Because they had to develop defense mechanisms and tools to protect themselves. So if you spend your life protecting yourself, obviously there's a lot of energy going into that. That is someone running from a fire, one way or another. The other type of restlessness is something that's a rare commodity, unfortunately, because it comes part of a healthy life, where you are driven to grow, not driven to run away from, but driven to run toward, as I pointed out. So why is this all relevant? It's relevant because to go back to the theme, why pain is a catalyst for growth, is because pain is essentially unhealthy restlessness. I'm talking about real pain that comes, because it's not coming from a place you'd want. The question is, can we create a healthy restlessness that would be the same motivator as unhealthy restlessness? Or let's put it this way, a positive type of quote-unquote pain that would compensate for and replace a negative type of pain. Because it's at the end of the day, what really causes the change and shift that pain and suffering brings out from a person is not the pain itself. It's the jolt and the shock to the system. That's what it is. It's not the pain per se that a person is in pain and therefore they grow. It's because their comfort zone, as I mentioned, their security blankets have been shaken up. So once it's shaken up, they can no longer stay there. So the question is, there's something that is just as powerful that you can find in the positive to shake yourself up with the same intensity that pain would shake you up. Because if you could answer that question, then we would have our formula. So that's what we have to be working on. So think of this as a laboratory, and we're developing this formula. Okay, so in looking for this, we're looking for precedents, stories or events or narratives where we find something of this nature. And we do. There's an interesting Talmudic statement. It talks about Rab Zera. Rab Zera was a great sage who mastered in the time, this we're talking about 2,000 years ago approximately, a little less. It was right after the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, the second temple. You know, what we see today, the Western Wall, is a remnant, a remaining outer wall of that temple. Or not of the temple, of the wall around the temple. So Rab Zera was so at that time there were two academies that developed, two higher education academies. What's called, one in Babylon, which is today modern day Iraq, and one in Jerusalem, two academies. And from there were developed what is known today as the Talmud. So we have what's called the Jerusalem Talmud, and we have a Babylonian Talmud. Behind me, I believe, is a Babylonian Talmud. It's usually a big set of around 60 books. And then you have a Jerusalem Talmud, which is smaller, but it's also quite extensive. Rab Zera, was a master, a known master, an expert in the study of Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was written in a very different style than the Babylonian Talmud. I'll explain that in a moment. Let me tell you the story. The story goes, the Talmud tells us, that Rab Zera at some point in his life decided he wanted to master now the Jerusalem Talmud, after years of being an expert in the Babylonian Talmud. Not just intellectual curiosity, but he was a man of growth. He wanted to get to another level. So it says that he fasted 100 fasts. Fasts. He deprived himself from eating and drinking, 100 fasts, meaning probably 100 consecutive days. Obviously not, he must have drank or ate something to be able to survive, but essentially 100 fasts in order to forget his knowledge of the Babylonian Talmud, in order to master the Jerusalem Talmud. That's the story. It's a very odd story, because since when, number one, is knowledge is accumulative? Why would you have to forget one piece of knowledge to absorb a new piece of knowledge? Everything you know, it becomes the building, becomes the foundation for what you grow upon. What you've learned yesterday or a year ago, 2 years ago, you may not know everything, but you know something, and then you build upon that. Why would you have to forget so-called yesterday's or his past scholarship in order to grow into his new scholarship? So the answer is very interesting and very practical when you think about it. That he was not looking to forget the knowledge. He was looking to forget the methodology, the mindset necessary in studying Babylonian Talmud. For example, if a person has studied, mastered physics, it's not that easy then to go over to a different type of school of thought entirely, because you may need different type of tools, different type of mind tools and mindset to be able to master a different, not the information, the methodology. Well, now why was he interested in doing so? Because he was a person who was truly looking for truth and was willing to pay the price. Now he could have said, look, I've developed a mindset, I've developed a set of a framework, a way of looking at things. Why would I need to change that? But he was a man, like I said, he was restless and was not satisfied with the status quo. Here's an example of a person who's using a positive type of restlessness to move and grow to another place. That's why he had to fast. Why didn't he just sit down? Because fasting broke his body. Fasting meant he was deprived of eating, so it changed his whole mindset. You know, if he would just continue to eat and drink like a regular, so he'd still be the person of yesterday. He needed to find a way to change his attitude. And the fasting did that. And I was reading somewhere, there's some advertising firm in LA. They're very high end. And when a client comes to them, they appoint a whole team to the client needs. And once they do their due diligence and they review the philosophy and the objectives of the organization or the company, and they want to develop now an advertising strategy. So they take their team, whoever is assigned to it, they take them to an amusement park that they rent out somewhere, maybe in Arizona or Colorado, I'm not sure, somewhere east of LA. And they go there, they travel there for a week, and literally go into they rent out a park where all the advertising people are expected to play around like they did when they were children in a sand lot with swings and whatever. I forgot all the things. So many years since I haven't done it myself. A seesaw. Very simple things, bringing them all back to their childhood, playing around, literally frolicking in this, and then they break out into sessions where they begin to review the strategy. Why do they do that? Because they need to take them out of their comfort zones. They want to take them out of the corporate offices in LA, and even their regular environment. They want to take them a completely different place where they literally have to change their whole attitudes. So when you take people out of their comfort zones, and here, take them back to their childhoods, suddenly what elicits is a whole new way of looking at things. A whole new, fresh way. I don't know if they do it today, but I remember in the early years of the web, it was insisted in MIT and other technology universities that anyone developing the next generation of the web is not allowed to know the earlier generation. Because if you're familiar with Web 1, you couldn't really develop Web 2 because it'd always be some form of Web 1 further. I don't like to quote this guy because of his own racist views, but Henry Ford, he was asked what kind of market research did he do when he came out with the Model T, the first automobile. So he said, no, zero market research. Why? He said, because if I would have asked people what they wanted, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. No one would say, I want an automobile. But like I said with the plane before, we always think in terms of our present context. Even if you consider yourself a nonconformist and you're thinking out of the box, or Taco Bell's out of the bun, or whatever, you always are using the box to be your point of reference. Because it's very, very difficult for us to get out of our framework. That's why pain is so effective, because pain forces you out. You don't want to get out. Who wants to get out of their existing framework? I'm comfortable there. Especially if you've met. If its life is miserable, that's a pain. But if things are going well, why would you want to shake it up? Suddenly comes a loss, God forbid, of a family member, a tragedy. No one should know of it, but I'm just giving you examples. A health issue, a financial issue. And now you're forced to get out. That's exactly why it works, because it's jolting you against your will into a place that you now are uncomfortable. You're in a place where you did not, or not used to, you're not trained to be here. So what do? You either sink, God forbid, or you swim. You figure out, how am I going to do it? So what we're looking for here is an alternative to that, without the painful side. So what can be a motivator? So in the case of Rabbi Zera, the sage I just mentioned, his motivation was just so powerful within. He was just such a restless soul. He didn't need a painful situation. He created his own pain, so to speak. He fasted to get out of his comfort zone in order to grow to another place. Most of us simply cannot do that because we don't have that type of strength. So it has to be thrust upon us. But the good news is, it doesn't mean it's impossible, it just means it's very difficult. It is ultimately easier through a difficult experience to get out, to jolt you and shock you, like a crack, than cracking yourself. But there are some tricks to the trade, and I'm going to share them in a few moments. So the bottom line is, what's the difference between the two methodologies? The two methodologies, the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem methodology, was one of, it's two intellectual schools of thought. One is, some argue that, and you'll find people have different strengths in these areas. There's some people who come to let's say you have a dilemma, a problem. What's the best way to find a solution to the problem? One approach would be to let your intuition work. Just open yourself up, and what does your intuition tell you? What do you feel? What do you sense? Try to almost guess, not guess, but try to feel your way around to get to the solution. Another way is the exact opposite approach. You dig the problem, you immerse yourself into the problem, and you start challenging it, and then you counter-challenge it, and you counter-challenge it. It's arguments, back and forth, back and forth. So in brainstorms, brainstorm sessions, you'll see some people are very good with just rattling off ideas. One idea. And others are very good at undermining ideas. Basically, arguing, finding the faults, finding the flaws, and saying, this is not good, not good. So which is the way to go? One, the way it's put, is one is going through darkness. One is going through a rigorous exertion of questions and answers and counter questions and challenging. That's the Babylonian approach. And the Jerusalem approach was far more a straighter. Let's try to shoot and get to the right point as fast as possible. And it's interesting, it says that the Babylonian approach, though it's a longer road, it ultimately achieves more clarity, because when you go through the darkness, you get to a point of clarity that you would not get to if you just were a smart guy. Because you've covered all the ground. It's like when you stretch an idea in every direction, far more likely you're going to come to a correct conclusion. So in practical terms, sometimes you have an idea. It's very healthy to challenge your idea. Don't wait till someone else does. And you stretch it in every different direction, and and then you ultimately can say, you know what? You may come back to the original idea, but now you know that you've experimented and attempted to say, what happens if I would do exact opposite? So that way you have the options. When someone just says, here's an idea, and it hasn't been challenged, you don't know. Maybe if it's challenged, it may not be upheld and withstand the challenge. So this is what Rabbi Zera wanted. The Babylonian he mastered. He wanted now to go to another dimension. In our situation, what propels us to greatness? So again, I said absolutely the easier path, unfortunately, is sadness and grief and frustration and loss. But there are paths, there are positive ways a person can get to that's harder, but you could do it. It's called commitment. If you commit to something and you're really committed to it, and you commit with another person, so then even when you start having regrets, why did you do this? Now you're stuck because you're committed. I can tell you, I use this backdoor trick all the time. You know, as I said, everybody wants to have some form of respite. But then you commit yourself to something that's good. Later you regret it, but it's too late because now you've promised it to a bunch of people. You made a commitment. You know, you sign a book contract. No way out. You know, there's a deadline. People expect. I've had over 34 years of doing this class, not in this location, but in the various locations. Trust me, I had more than 34 excuses not to do it. There's a cold, you're under the weather, over the weather, in between, you know, it's going to rain, it's going to snow. But I learned from good people in my life that when you commit to something good, stick to it no matter what. Now, that's not painful. It is painful in the sense because the commitment forces you to do things you don't always like. But it's not painful, God forbid, in the sense of that I described before as real negative pain. So there is a solution. The solution is to find that same type of commitment that you would have, that pain would force upon you unwillingly, to willingly bring it upon yourself, and that way it's up to you. See, pain and loss is not up to us. That's why it shakes us up, because it's not planned. So that's why it really takes you out of your comfort zone. It jolts you to a new place. But imagine you were able to, through commitment, because you want to grow, or commitment to another person, or because there's a moment of inspiration. But you got to get yourself stuck in it. There's no way. You have to get in a situation where there's no way out. If you have a back door, no. Even 1% back door is no good, because that means you'll find a way to squirm out. You know? It has to be absolute. Like, you know, you enlist in the army, there's no way out. And trust me, I'm sure that nobody's there is having a nice day every day. There's a boot camp, you get your thing kicked, etc. So the point is that we have to find these positives. Now, one can say, and I believe it was Vov Tishrei Tovshem Mem Aleph. Okay, you know that from Brengan, right? Yeah, but there was something else said then. It was a talk that my teacher, mentor, Rebbe gave, and he was talking about this week's chapter. He wasn't talking about the chapter per se. It's not that time of year. It's in the holiday season between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But he was mentioned a verse in this chapter. Besides the verse I referred to earlier, that as they were oppressed, that's how they proliferated. There's another verse. The verse says that how were they oppressed? How were they oppressed? Something that why are we being told this? B'chemer u'b'levenim. That Pharaoh and the Egyptians oppressed the Jews with hard labor. B'chemer u'b'levenim in Hebrew means with bricks and mortar. They gave them straw, minimal resources, and said, go make bricks out of this. And it's a whole emphasis in this week's chapter, how that was how they tortured them. You know, one thing, hard labor is one thing, but imagine someone says, go build a building, and they give you nothing to build with, and you have to build. Okay, so the expression is chemer and levenim. It's the Hebrew word for bricks and mortar. Now, some say the pyramids, maybe the Sphinx as well, that exist in Egypt were built by the Jewish people. The joke was going when there was the Arab Spring, which has now turned into an Arab winter, or whatever you want to call it, but the Arab Spring, remember when the Egyptian uprising, so there were news, so there was a lot of rebellion then against Mubarak, and there was the different things that were happening, so the joke was going around that the Jews sent a telegram to the Egyptians that, listen, don't destroy the pyramids because we're not coming back to rebuild them. Okay, that was the joke. Fine. But the point being is that the Zohar, if you've heard of the Zohar, is the classic text of Jewish mysticism, says something very interesting and very actually strange. It says, B'chemer, the word chemer is a play of words, says, do kal v'chomer. What does that mean? It's a certain methodology, a Talmudic methodology of deriving an idea from another idea. And it just has one thing in common. It sounds chemer, kal v'chemer. Because chomer chomer would be like saying two words that sound alike, so they have the same. And the Levanim, the Zohar says libun hilchasa, which means the crystallization of an idea. So of course the obvious question is, what is this? Some type of play of words? Just because two words sound alike doesn't mean they have any relationship. What is the methodology, intellectual methodology, have to do with bricks? And what does crystallization have to do with mortar? So that talk in 1980 would be, said the Rebbe said something very powerful. He said, you have the choice in life. We all will have to struggle in life. Everyone's going to struggle in life at some point. The question is, will the struggle be one with bricks and mortar, meaning a negative type of struggle where you have to work hard and in an oppressive way, or will it be intellectual exertion in study and intellectual curiosity that will drive you? But they're both exertion, and it's your choice. So in other words, we can actually free ourselves from some of the pains of life if we bring upon ourselves our own pains. I don't mean it that way, I mean in a positive way. We bring upon ourselves our own challenges. But if you're going to just live a life of complacency and apathy, then, yes, no pun intended, you could be hit with bricks and mortar in a real way, and then it's not according to your plan. It'll shake you up, and it may make you grow, but it's not. But for the moment, it's not going to be pleasant. So we have the option number 2, which is to choose, as that scholar did, commitments that force us out of our comfort zone, against our will. And I speak from personal experience. I'm a procrastinator like anybody is. I don't think there's a thing called Procrastinators Anonymous, because they'll never make it by the time But procrastinate. Anybody a procrastinator here? We all have our procrastination gene. I remember once on the radio, it was a very funny ad. So you hear a guy starts the ad is the guy says, okay, well, he's like at a 12-step program, and he says, okay, I've been procrastinating now for 2 years, 3 months. And I've stopped procrastinating for 2 years and 3 months and and a week. And everybody says, okay, welcome, John, whatever. And he says, let me tell you how I finally hit me when I hit rock bottom. So it's an ad for Norwegian cruises. Norwegian Cruises announced a 50% sale. They said you have to sign up by November 1st, 8 a.m. And I called at 8:01, and that was it. So I hit rock bottom, and then I realized I was a full-fledged procrastinator. I don't care about the ad. The point was I like the wittiness. Fine. So procrastination, it's a discussion of its own. What's the way to challenge procrastination? Usually it doesn't work just to say, you know what, I'm not going to procrastinate anymore, because, as we all know, how long is that going to last? So another way is, God forbid, as I said, something that we don't expect, something you can't procrastinate because there's a crisis, there's danger. God forbid, I said. And the third way is you commit to something before something negative happens that you can't procrastinate. I've done this hundreds of times in my life. I regret it every time, but I do it, and I do it till this day. Today I had an office meeting, and I committed myself to some things, which today I look at myself, how could you do that? But all great things come from that, because then you're forced, and you have no choice. It's like almost recognizing that human nature is going to need something to kick you in the pants, to get you out of your comfort zone. So either you kick yourself, or life will kick you. It really comes down to that. Now that's not my motivation personally, because I don't want to get kicked. My motivation is because I really want to achieve something, but you have to do so. How do you do it? So that's why finding someone else, a partner, finding a team, anything that you cannot get out of. And as hard as it is, like Americans hate the word commitment, by the way. They hate the word commitment. You know why? Because we live in a very comfortable world, and we want to not have to be locked into anything. How often you tell people, you want to do this? They say, well, if I can get out, if I have the option, I'll do it. But I don't want to be locked in. Obviously, this, of course, is a knee-jerk reaction to being locked in a bad way, which means being held hostage or in some way being trapped. But what about locking yourself in by will? You chose to lock yourself in because it's a good thing. That's called a healthy commitment. And that healthy commitment can save your life because now you must do it, even when you're not in the mood. So when people say, explain to me why I should do it, in a way that defeats the purpose. Maybe we don't need a why. The why is simply because it's something that your comfort zone doesn't like. That alone is a good reason. So that ultimately is what I'm developing now. I can't say that I'm going to say this evening that I have it all figured out because the resistance is still there. But at least there's some type of hope. You can say some type of formula. And I really think it's possible. I think that each of us takes upon a resolution to do something. You call someone up. I'm not talking about in your heart and your brain or your mind, theoretically. You call someone up and say, listen, I want to do this. I want to commit. I want you to commit with me. I want us to each hold each other accountable. And do things that there's no way back. There's no way back. There's an interesting story that it always bothered me, but I recently realized that this is the answer to the story. There was a man from Chicago, a businessman. He came to New York, and he came to meet the previous Chabad Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneers. He was one of his chassidim, one of his followers. And he was a man that had business and was relatively successful. And the Rebbe asked him, his teacher, the Rebbe asked him to dedicate a series of books. They were publishing then some books. So he said to the Rebbe, I'd love to do it. He asked the Rebbe how much money. He said to him a sum, which was relatively a high sum. And he said to the Rebbe, I'd love to do it, I just don't have the money. I want to live up to my commitment. I don't see it possible, I don't have the means. So the Rebbe answered a very interesting answer. He says, if you make the commitment, it'll open up new channels that you'll be able to fulfill your commitment. So even though you don't see now on paper how you're going to live up to it, but if you make the commitment, that will open up new channels. So I always used to think about this story because it's a beautiful story. Actually, he made the commitment, by the way, and it did open up new channels. He became far wealthier, was able to do that and many other projects. So he didn't become impoverished from it, let's put it this way. But I was wondering, is this story like a miraculous story, like the Rebbe's giving him a blessing, you make the commitment, I guarantee you that new channels open? Or is it a little more, can you explain it also scientifically? And I'm convinced now you could explain it scientifically, because it's all about what we think we're capable of. Businessmen will tell you, any business person will tell you, the biggest successes come with great risks, right? Like I said before, you need a risk. Some people, I think the Wall Street Journal advertises the greatest risk is taking no risk, or some other money fund, I don't know, whatever. So, risk. Now, risk is risk of loss. Simply put, it's real loss. You may be able to absorb the loss, but it's loss. But that's how you get the higher risk, the more return. When a person has the mental aptitude, the mental courage to be able to take a serious risk or to go out on the limb, that means that opens up for them a certain expansiveness. People who are very narrow or very limited will say, I can't, very cautious. I understand the caution. What the Rebbe was telling him is that if you open up your mind to something that you don't think you're capable of now, and you know that you've made the commitment, you're going to live up to the commitment. And then you're going to work harder, and you're going to find new ways. This way you're not going to push yourself. So it's exactly the point. It means that when we make commitments that are sometimes beyond us, which is not what we want to do, there's no question. Which rational person says, I'm going to do something I don't feel I can do now? But then you say to yourself, one second, but it's the right thing to do. And I was told that it's possible. So maybe I have to stop letting myself be in the way of my own too many calculations. Now, of course, this has to be done with measure and moderation. I'm not suggesting something completely crazy. Someone will say, I could jump up 20 stories. I'm sure I can jump up. But we're not talking about something like supernatural, something crazy. We're talking about how much do we have inside of us. Now, the best proof is people will say, I have no time. Then suddenly there's a tragedy and they suddenly have a lot of time, unfortunately. Why? Because in your structure, you feel you don't have time. And then suddenly, do we have to wait for something negative? The point is that if you really want something and it's really valuable, it will force you to open up new channels. There's not a question. And that's true on an intellectual level, on an emotional level, and on an action-based level. So, my friends, yes, so from Egypt we learned something. The oppression made them proliferate and grow. But it also teaches us it doesn't need to always be oppression in the negative sense. It could be chamr levenim, it can be the other type of restlessness. That is what drives us to become far greater entities. So in practically speaking, nobody can force anybody to do anything, but my suggestion would be, find yourself something of this nature. Test it. You don't have to do it cold turkey, in every area of your life. Find one thing, commit to it, find someone to commit with, and make sure you can't get out of it. That's the key. And you tell me if it doesn't open up new channels. There's not even a question in my mind it does, because that will propel you. It's that it drives you and propels you. Now I can tell you right now, I'll make a full confession here. I don't like we don't believe in confession. Full disclosure. I have a few projects I'm convinced I must do. I've been procrastinating. I mean, not to say I know that I'm going to do, but I've not made that final leap. I said next month, let me get this done and that done, then I'll start. So since I'm preaching, I got to practice what I preach. So in my mind, I just made myself that decision and commitment. It's writing a book, actually, that I have the ideas already, but I need to solidify it. So that's my thing. But every one of us can find something. Now I have to find, of course, a few people because it can't be just a commitment to yourself. It has to be that others call you on it, or else you're going to get out of it. That's how it is. It's like we are very good squirmers. We'll squirm out of any situation if we're not compelled. So find yourself your thing. I don't know is it connected to New Year's resolutions. It doesn't really matter to me. I don't really care. That's not relevant to the point here. You want to call it New Year resolution, be a New Year resolution. Maybe the point is, however, for our own growth and for our own capacity, potential, we have to push each other in a healthy way. We have to challenge each other. We have to provoke is a good word. Provoke each other. So I'll try to do my job in provoking, and I hope you provoke me, I provoke you, and with that we can maybe create some real magic. So here I make my pledge and my offer as well. If anybody is interested in doing something of that nature, and you want me you want to let me know about it, I'd be happy to hear about it and maybe it can be of help. And the bottom line is that in some way or another we should all join together in this battle. And I have no doubt as well that when you do that, it is the best preventive medicine to avoid the need for any painful or negative, unwanted visitors, so to speak, by bringing in the positive visitors. So that's a thought on this week's chapter as well. A thought about, can we grow throughout pain? So the answer is yes, I believe we can, but it takes a lot more work than pain. Pain is the easier way. I know that sounds weird, but it's the easier way because it does it for you against your will. Here it's against your will, but it can be more pleasant. So with that said, we continue this journey every week, Wednesday night, and it's an honor and blessing to speak to you all. Great to meet you, and I hope the live version is better than the online one. But either way, and everyone be well. Everyone have a very good week. Do I have your email addresses? If not, please write it down, and let's stay in touch. Okay, thank you so much. Have a pleasant week, a nice evening. Thank you.